Chapter 176 Press Conference, Part 1. Mia's fingers tightened around her phone as she continued to read the tweets and trends on Twitter. Though a lot of people were hating on her, it wasn't as much as they were hating on Neil and hoping he got killed. She'd never felt so determined to make something right, like she felt to clear his name at this point. And despite her current condition, where she still felt shaken after what had happened, she knew she had to start preparing for the press conference and get it over with, not for herself, but for Neil's sake. No matter what happened, she'd make sure to change something about his current situation. Even though she had a lot of things she needed to worry about, things like the strange feeling she'd had last night in her storage room, where she woke up forgetting what had caused her to pass out, and also Owen, who she was now determined as ever to place a restraining order on so he'd never approach her again in the future. Her manager had called to tell her the bad news of her image in the entertainment industry slowly dragging to the mud because of her involvement with Neil, but she knew her ruined image would naturally be restored if she were to succeed in her plans in the press conference. The entire time it took for Mia to finish scrolling through her phone, Rain had sat in front of her studying her expression as she went through the trending tweets about her and Neil. "What happened between you and Wayner?" Rain asked, finally understanding that Mia wasn't referring to Owen earlier when she said she loved him despite what he'd done to her. She was referring to Neil, and it was evident by her expression as she read the tweets about him. Mia put her phone away, her expression turned distant as she began to tell Rain everything that had happened, from the moment she'd seen Neil crouching down before her car in Novaria to the moment when he told her she was too naive and inexperienced to know the difference between love and sexual desires. "Based on everything you've just shared," Rain remarked, wrapping a comforting arm around her, "it seems like he's in love with you but is in denial. It could also be that he's in denial because he's an escaped convict and believes you deserve someone better than him. I've seen similar situations in movies." "I know," Mia sighed, looking down at her hands on her lap. "I had thought the same at first. But you're mistaken. Neil is different. He refuses to love or allow himself to be vulnerable to that feeling. I also believe he's innocent, and his involvement in this mess was because of me. I want to do everything in my power to help him, even though he doesn't want my help. And before I put him completely out of my mind tomorrow, I intend to take care of it through the press conference that would be shown worldwide this afternoon." "How do you plan to do that?" Rain inquired anxiously, trailing behind Mia as she rose from the bed and headed to her closet, as if she hadn't just been crying moments before. "I intend to make absolutely certain the rest of the world knows that I don't think he killed my mom or anyone. Maybe if I do a good enough job at the press conference, public opinion might force the authorities to see the truth as well." Rain watched her peel off her robe. "You would still do that for him, even though he misused and hurt your feelings?" Mia gave her a winsome smile and nodded emphatically. "I would do anything for him." In the Galvera enterprise in Mirage Mesa, Liam and James, who was Neil's assistant in the company, and two other men were seen seated around the conference meeting room with countless documents scattered on the table. Liam, with a pair of reading glasses perched low on his nose, used his hand to soothe his throbbing headache. He had not slept a wink since Neil had called him the day before with their plan to clear his name, and now they were engrossed in making it happen. While Liam delved into the investigation papers, James was overheard speaking on the phone. Once he finished the call, he informed the group, "One of our investigators just told me that Miss Harrison is discussing Xavier on TV." Standing up, James switched on the large screen in the room and navigated to the live stream of the press conference. Liam felt uneasy at the thought of Mia talking about Neil on TV. If she were to say anything wrong about him or charge him for kidnapping, she'd be making everything a lot worse. Too tense to sit down, Liam shoved his hands into his pants pockets and watched in taut silence as the pretty young woman stepped up to the bank of microphones, wearing a simple pink wool dress with black buttons at the collar and cuffs, her long hair caught at the nape in a pleated bow. "Heavens help him," James said, referring to Neil. "She looks like Snow White, which is going to make the whole world scream for his blood if she were to say anything bad about him." James muttered. He had never seen Mia's face this close on camera, even though she was the most talked about person in the news, and he'd never known she was this beautiful and that his big boss had taken an angel with him when escaping. No man would be able to resist such innocent beauty, and he hoped this beauty was on their side. If not, he'd be forced to hate her for life if she were to complicate their hard work by saying something wrong about Xavier. The men watched in silence as Mia began to explain what had happened to her at the hands of Neil when he took her from Novaria. Liam's worried frown began to slowly fade, and then, slowly, it gave way to an astonished smile as he heard everything she was saying about his friend. Chapter 177 Press Conference, Part 2. The men watched in silence as Mia began to explain what had happened to her at the hands of Neil when he took her from Novaria. Liam's worried frown began to fade, and then, slowly, it gave way to an astonished smile as he heard everything she was saying about his friend. Contrary to his expectations, Neil's so-called hostage was somehow managing to describe her week with him as if it had been an adventure she'd had. She described him as extremely kind instead of a terrifying, cold-hearted escaped murderer everyone had thought him to be. When she explained the truth behind her attempted escape at the rest stop, when the truck driver had seen them, and told of Neil's quick-witted method of thwarting her, she did it in a way that evoked a ripple of reluctant, admiring laughter from several members of the press. And when she solemnly described her second attempted escape on a snowbike and Neil's effort to rescue her from the frozen river, she made him sound like the compassionate hero she clearly believed he was. At the end of her statement, the room filled with dozens of questions from the press, and Liam and his men tensed at the sharp edge they all had. "Miss Harrison," a reporter called out, "did Neil Wayner at any time threaten you at gunpoint?" "I was aware that he had a gun as I had seen it," she answered confidently, smiling. "That alone was sufficient to dissuade me, at least initially, from engaging in any conflict with him or questioning his power." Laughter erupted in the room, followed by more shouted questions. "Miss Harrison, when Wayner is recaptured, will you press kidnapping charges against him?" With a teasing smile, she shook her head and replied, "No way. I mean, if there were women in the courtroom, they'd release him in a minute, as soon as they heard he did half the cooking and cleaning up when we were together. We heard he is a psychopath. Did he rape you?" She rolled her eyes in amused disbelief. "Now really, I've just given you a detailed account of what happened during the entire week, and I specifically said that he did not physically abuse me at any time. I certainly couldn't have said that if he had even attempted to commit such a despicable act. Did he ever threaten to take your life at any point?" someone demanded. She laughed. "No. Were you afraid of him at any time, Miss Harrison?" "I was afraid of his gun during the first day," she said carefully, "but when he didn't shoot me after my attempt to pass a note to a girl in a fast food restaurant, nor after my next 2 escape attempts, I realized that he wasn't going to hurt me, no matter how much I provoked him." Again and again, Liam watched her deflect their questions and managed to begin swaying them from animosity to empathy toward Neil. After about 30 minutes of relentless questions, the pace began to slow. A reporter called out, "Miss Harrison, do you want to see Neil Wayner captured?" She turned her face in the direction of the reporter and said, "How could anyone possibly want to see a man who was unjustly imprisoned sent back to prison? I don't know how a judge ever convicted him, but I do know that he's no more capable of killing innocent people than I am. If he were capable of it, I would not be standing here now, because as I explained to all of you a few minutes ago, I repeatedly tried to jeopardize his escape. What I'd like to see happen is for this manhunt to be stopped while he has the chance to prove himself." In a firm, courteous tone, she concluded, "If you have no more questions, ladies and gentlemen, we can end this interview and you can all go back to your homes." "I have one more question," a reporter shouted imperiously. "We know about your engagement with Mr. Sullivan, but we'd like to know if you were in love with Wayner." She looked at him, lifted her graceful brows, and disdainfully replied, "I'd expect a question like that from the paparazzi, but not the news channel." Her attempt to sidestep that question got her laughter, but no success this time, because a man from the paparazzi spoke. "Okay, Miss Harrison, we'll ask the question. Are you in love with Neil Wayner?" It was the only time Liam saw her falter, and he suddenly felt sorry for her as he watched her struggle to keep her smile in place, and her expression indifferent, but her eyes betrayed her. Those huge, long-lashed brown eyes turned dark and solemn with an emotion that distinctly resembled tenderness towards his friend. And just when Liam's sympathy for her was at its peak, just when he realized the reporters had finally trapped her, she changed tactics and walked willingly into their trap in a way that made him draw in a sharp breath at her courage and confidence. "At one time or another," she said, "most of the female population of this country has probably imagined themselves in love with the infamous hero of our generation. Now that I've known the real him personally, with no disguises," she added with a tiny break in her voice, "I think they showed excellent judgment. She hesitated, visibly searching for the right words, and then she said simply, he is a very easy man for any woman to love." Without another word, she turned away from the bank of microphones and was quickly surrounded by men whom Liam presumed were probably her bodyguards, who ushered her safely off the stage. The cameras followed her out until she got into her car along with her red-haired friend, who he'd noticed had stood beside her the whole time. James pressed the off button on the remote controller just as Liam was about to see the face of the red-haired woman up close, and he cursed under his breath as the TV turned blank and directed his glare at James, who was completely oblivious to his mistake, and asked, "What do you think of that? I mean Miss Harrison's words?" James asked. "I think," Liam said quietly as he overlooked the man's mistake, "that she did well for Neil." "Do you think Xavier fell in love with that angel while they were together?" James asked, stroking his beardless jaw. He'd known Xavier for all the years he'd been hired to work as a spy in the Galvera enterprise while he was away doing the military work, but he'd never known his big boss to have any interest in women. He'd never seen him look at any woman more than once or even give them any attention that would require him to entertain them. Nonetheless, since Liam was Xavier's best friend, only he knew if Xavier had changed throughout the years before he was sent to prison. No, Liam answered with absolute certainty. Besides the fact that he'd have had much more pressing things on his mind at the time they were together, Neil is almost immune to women. He enjoys them sexually, but he doesn't have much respect for them, which isn't surprising given his past. We've been friends for long. Though he might have given Mia a little more attention than most women, he certainly wouldn't involve any feelings. In fact, the only real tenderness I've ever seen him show is to elder women. He doesn't like children nor young women. Shaking his head for emphasis, Liam finished, Neil would never fall in love with a pretty young woman like Miss Harrison, not in a few years, not even in a few weeks. I somehow disagree with that, Sir Liam, James said with a chuckle. From what I've gathered from what Miss Harrison said, I think Xavier has changed. Imagine, why would he want to die when he thought she'd died? That's not the Xavier I know. Are you trying to tell me you know him more than I do, James? Liam raised a challenging brow. He'd known Neil more than anyone, and he knew his friend doesn't do love, not now and not ever, he'd always say. James raised his hands in surrender. No, I'm just saying the obvious. What's the obvious because I don't see it? It's obvious that Mr. Galvera has fallen in love, James argued, making Liam remove his glasses to say, all right, how about this, let's make a bet. I say Neil is not in love with that woman, but you said otherwise. If I were to be proven right, you will work as my driver for a year without pay, and if you were to be proven right, I will give you whatever you desire as long as I have it. James looked reluctant for a moment, as he didn't want to work as Liam's driver, knowing full well he'd never be able to get a night's sleep again because of how the man would work at night with his driver like vampires. He'd also felt sorry for Liam's driver, and the last thing he wanted was to take his place without pay, but it was worth it to bet because if he were to win, he'd request anything from Liam. I agree. Chapter 178 Pregnant. After the day of the press conference, the internet was all about Neil Weiner and how some women found him romantic. This was due to what Mia had said about him, and how he'd tried to kill himself when he'd thought she'd died in the frozen river. A lot of women who had wished him death were now secretly idolizing him as their ideal man and the perfect boyfriend material, while also rooting for him to clear his name if he were indeed innocent. A lot of Mia's fans didn't sit still. They were all supporting Neil and roasting the haters who wished otherwise. The first week following the press conference was overwhelming for Mia, as she was constantly bombarded with interview requests and questioning. Numerous entertainment channels offered to pay any amount for her to retell her story of the adventure with Neil. The media attention became so intense that she had to turn off her phone for a week to escape the paparazzi who hounded her every move. Wherever she went, there were always paparazzi invading her life and activities. They'd not given her breathing space ever since her return. On the other hand, she was relieved that her days were hectic, as it kept her occupied dealing with the media and prevented her from dwelling on thoughts of Neil and the unnecessary worries about whether he missed her as much as she missed him. It had been almost a month since she returned from the mountain cabin to reality, but only now, lying alone in bed feeling unwell and down after a hospital visit, did she allow herself to miss him. Last week, she obtained a restraining order against Owen, who had been pestering her after she publicly ended their engagement. She had not seen him recently, as she had been homebound due to feeling a little under the weather. She'd been feeling nauseous and sick for the past 6 days she'd been at home, but she'd thought it was due to all the stress she'd had to endure throughout the weeks until she went for the checkup this morning and realized otherwise. The friendly female doctor had looked at her with a beaming smile and congratulated her while announcing the results of her checkup. "Congratulations, Miss Harrison, you are 3 weeks pregnant. Mr. Sullivan will be happy to hear this. I saw how he'd been supporting the orphanage recently. He seemed like the kind to love children," said the doctor, who had been her doctor ever since she'd become famous, and since the doctor knew Owen as her fiancé, she'd naturally assumed she was carrying his child. Mia had sat there in astonishment, like a fool, blinking repeatedly at that announcement. She'd never thought her little morning sickness would turn out to be pregnancy. Though she'd been late on her period this month, she'd thought it was due to stress only to be told she was carrying the child of a man who'd told her to her face that she was too inexperienced to know the difference between love and sexual desires. The same man who would soon clear his name and resume his old life without caring if she exists. The thought of being pregnant for the man she loved would have been the most wonderful feeling in the world, but now that she was going through a lot, both mentally and physically, she couldn't think of what to do if the world were to know of her pregnancy and who the father was. She wouldn't have to worry about what the world would think if Neil had told her to wait for him. She had been hoping he'd even call her or text her after their separation, but he seemed not to really care about her enough to bother. Her life had not been the same ever since she'd returned, and now she'd have to face the shame of carrying his child alone. She missed him terribly. She missed the feel of his strong arms around her and the feel of his lips on hers, the caresses of his hands on her bare skin. She missed everything about him. Her heart ached with a pain that would never go away. With so much pain, how could she mother a child without its father's support? Furthermore, he didn't seem like a man who liked children. He'd probably advise her to abort the child if he were to ever know about it. Tears blurred her vision as she lay face up on her bed staring blankly at the ceiling, and when she blinked, they began to stream down her cheeks like a loose dam. Mia was too lost in her despair. She didn't realize when Rain came in. She didn't even hear her name being called until she felt a hand tap her shoulder, jerking her back to her senses. "I saw your voicemail. Oh my goodness, Mia, I couldn't believe it at first. What do you plan to do now?" Rain exclaimed as Mia sat up straighter on the bed and pulled a pillow up to her chest to cuddle. Trying to act normal, like it wasn't a big deal, Mia shrugged. "I don't know. That's why I called you when I figured out I'm pregnant." Sitting on the bed, Rain tried to gauge her friend's expression, but it was hard to tell what she really felt when she'd closed up her emotions. "Are you going to keep it or—" "Of course," she interjected before Rain could mention the word abortion, as that was the last resort she would consider. She was determined not to terminate her pregnancy due to the actions of the father. She was resolved to keep the baby even if it meant raising it alone. "I have no intention of having an abortion. I'm just unsure of how to proceed. She dissolved into tears before she could continue, and Rain enveloped her in a hug. "It's all right, you have time to consider your options. How about this, let's go shopping as we had planned. There's a new mall that just opened in the city with top-notch stores. I'm free from work today, and I could use a break from reality just as much as you. I also want to move on from Max and start afresh. Let's not dwell on those guys who broke our hearts and have a good time for once. What do you say?" Rain suggested, pulling away from the hug to gaze down at Mia's teary eyes as she nodded in agreement. "That sounds like a great idea. I want to forget about everything for now, especially Neil." Chapter 179 Decision to contact her. Against the setting sun of Verdantia, a country that was known for its year-round summer with hundreds of islands, a tall man walked down the dusty road that led from the city to the quiet docks, a newspaper and several documents in his hand. As he headed down the island pier, he spoke to none of the men who were working to upload their cargo from the ship, and none of them spoke to him. But several pairs of curious eyes followed the stranger toward his private yacht that had been on shore for weeks. It was a Ferretti Yacht 1000, which they'd never seen nor come close to touching in their entire life. One glance at the yacht, and you'd know the owner was not someone of their class who they'd dare mingle with, even though they'd seen him around for the past week. One thing that also stood out from the brand new yacht was the painted words on it. It had the name Mia boldly stenciled on the stern in fresh, purple, expensive, shiny paint. The men who worked at the dock could only look and admire the yacht without going closer to it, due to the 2 bodyguards standing guard whenever the owner was not around. Like the yacht, everything about the tall man who was casually walking towards it stood out. Instead of the clothes worn by a charter captain, who they all assumed he was at first. He wore a plain white shirt with loose sleeves and khaki pants, soft-soled shoes, and a dark cap pulled low over his brows. His face was slightly tanned beneath his cap, though if anyone had looked closely, they'd have noticed that he was the same man who'd been trending worldwide, both in newspapers and on TV. But this was a busy island port where the poor struggled to make a living by uploading cargo, and the yacht that was named Mia had told them enough about the man not being someone they'd dare try to go close to. Across the pier, 2 workers aboard the cargo ship looked up as the yacht owner went aboard. Moments later, the yacht's generator purred to life and the luxurious yacht lights came on, giving them the full view of the luxury beyond them. "Who is this man? He just wastes fuel running that generator half the night in that yacht," one worker observed the yacht from a distance, hating the rich man for just being there. "What does he even do to be able to afford such a yacht? He must be some spoiled brat from a foreign country, because we Verdantians don't have such money and privilege. Sometimes I see his shadow at a table in the yacht through the curtains. I think he sits and reads all night without sleeping. He must be some wealthy businessman." The other workers looked meaningfully at the luxurious yacht and continued to say, "The man dresses too casually for a rich man wealthy enough to afford such a yacht, yet he never seeks no charter customer. I saw him yesterday anchored out near Rosemary Island doing nothing but sunbathing and staring lost at the sea." The first worker snorted in disgust. "Because he is no charter captain, but some wastrel who'd come to Verdantia to remind us how poor we are. He must be another drug runner from some other country. What else did you think?" His companion agreed with a disinterested shrug as they resumed their work and ignored the yacht and its weird owner. Unaware that his presence was causing any comment along the docks, Neil casually studied the documents he'd gone out to collect from Liam's assistant this evening, carefully studying their progress in the upcoming plans to set him free and also reading through the brief progress of his company in Mirage Mesa, which had been run by Liam in his absence. He sat by the table busying himself in work until it was 4 a.m. in the morning. He closed the documents and remained sitting on the chair because he knew even if he were to go to bed he wouldn't be able to sleep a wink, even though he was exhausted and burned out emotionally. Sleep was something that had eluded him almost completely for the past weeks he'd left that mountain cabin. Even though his journey from the mountains had gone off without a hitch, thanks to his wealth and to the connection he'd made because of Kai, he'd been able to pay people to leave the country unseen. His private jet had appeared a few hours after Mia had left and picked him up from the mountains to Verdantia, a country where he knew he would be safe until everything was cleared and done as planned. Immediately he arrived at his first destination, a limo had been waiting for him, and from there he had driven south to a small landing where another private jet was waiting, as scheduled, on a cleared landing strip. Unlike his first private jet, the second one was more luxurious and comfortable where he'd had a private resting area and a kitchen. The flight had been long and tiring to the point he'd fallen asleep, waking up only when they landed at Verdantia Island, where he had already made arrangements for his brand new limited edition yacht to be brought. He'd even requested for them to name it by the name he'd been unable to remove from his mind ever since he had left the mountains. Mia. Standing up from the chair, Neil went down to the galley and lit a cigarette before pouring himself wine, hoping it would help him sleep for a while, knowing it wouldn't, just like last night. Then he carried it up to the furnished living room that had everything he'd needed in any home or hotel. He turned off the room's main lights, but he left the small lamp lit on the table beside the sofa because it illuminated the picture of Mia that he had printed out online and put into a small frame he'd asked his guard to get for him. Originally, he had assumed it was probably her university graduation picture, but tonight as he studied it and inhaled his scented cigarettes while sipping his wine, he realized the picture had more likely been taken when she was dressed for a party or perhaps an event. She was wearing a diamond pearl necklace around her throat and a blue dress with a modest neckline that didn't reveal much skin, but what he liked most about the picture was that she was wearing her hair similar to the night they'd dressed up for a date in the cabin. Knowing he was torturing himself by keeping her picture and yet unable to stop, he reached out and picked up the picture frame. Then he propped his ankle on the opposite knee and laid the picture against his leg. Slowly, he ran his thumb over her smiling lips, wondering if she was smiling again now that she was back home with her fiancé. He'd been tempted to look her up online and know how she was doing, but he'd held back because he wanted her to move on and be happy. He hoped to the heavens she was happy, but as he gazed at her picture, what he saw was the last image he had of her, the wrenching look on her face when he had ridiculed her for saying she loved him. The memory of that haunted him every night. It tore at him along with other worries about her, like whether or not she was pregnant. Not once had they used protection during their lovemaking all night, and since he was the one who'd deflowered her, he knew she hadn't been using any birth control pills before nor after. The chances that he'd gotten her pregnant were high, and he tortured himself constantly, wondering if she would have to endure an abortion or endure the shame of unwed motherhood somewhere without him, or if she'd make that bastard Owen father his child. Years ago, the thought of loving a woman or having a child with her would have made him feel disgusted, but now, he didn't even know what he wanted anymore. If there was one thing he was sure about, it was the fact that he wanted Mia in his life, and if she were pregnant with his child, he wanted them both. If he were to see her again, there were so many things he wanted to tell her, so many things he needed desperately to say to her. He swallowed the rest of his wine, fighting the urge to pick up his new phone and ask Liam to help him get her personal number so he could send the long messages he'd typed down on his phone last night when he imagined he was going to send it to her. Every day, he typed down words he wanted to say to her, which he couldn't say in person, even though he knew damn well he couldn't send them. He had to stop doing that, Neil warned himself. He had to put her out of his mind before he went insane, missing her like a madman. He had to get some sleep and focus on his plans and getting back to business once he cleared his name. And even while he was thinking that, he was reaching for his phone on the table and began to type yet another message he knew he wasn't going to send because he didn't even have her personal number. Sometimes he told her where he was and what he was doing in the message. Sometimes he described in great detail things he thought would interest her if she were here, like Rosemary Island, where he'd visited yesterday to get some breath of fresh air. But tonight he was in a much different mood. Tonight, exhaustion and wine sent his rampaging regrets and worries soaring to new heights. According to the outdated newspapers he'd seen today, Mia had gone ahead and spoke up for him in a press conference. It suddenly occurred to him that if she were indeed pregnant with his child, it would not take a genius to figure out that he was the father. And from what she'd done, his uncle would be on her tail soon and try to do the same thing he did to him to his child. She was going to need his protection, not just from his uncle, but from Da Kroll, who would do anything to destroy anything that matters to him. Now that he wasn't around her, she'd needed someone to protect her, or perhaps he could arrange for her to leave the country until he was free. A new sense of urgency banished the despair that had clouded his thinking since she left him, and his mind began to work furiously, coming up with new problems and sudden solutions. It was dawn when he leaned back in his chair, weary and completely beaten. Beaten, because he knew he was going to have to contact her. He dialed Liam's phone number and called him. Chapter 180 Ask if she's pregnant. Liam lay face down on his bed, the darkness of sleep finally embracing him after a week of relentless nights trying to work in his own company along with the Galvera enterprise and also working on his friend's case at the same time. Not once had he gotten to rest. He'd just gotten off work at dawn and wanted to have a few hours of sleep before the sun rose. But just as he began to drift into the sweet solace of slumber, his phone rudely shattered his peace. He groped for it on the nightstand, annoyance lacing his muttered curses. Without bothering to check the caller ID, he answered, his voice laced with irritation. "Whoever you are, you better have a damn good reason for waking me up." "It's me, Liam." Neil's urgent voice pierced through the haze of his sleep, instantly banishing any remnants of drowsiness left in him. Liam quickly sat up because he knew Neil wouldn't call unless it was an emergency, and the thought that something had happened made his senses on high alert. "Neil, is everything all right? Has someone recognized you there?" "No." Neil's response was clipped, urgent. "I need a favor. Can you get me Mia's personal number or email right now?" Liam was caught off guard by that sudden request because it was very unlike his friend to want a woman's phone number when he should be worrying about something else, and the fact that he'd called by this time for that made him suddenly wary that he was about to lose a bet with James about his friend's feelings for the woman. Not to mention the fact that the last time he spoke to Neil, he'd vehemently denied having any feelings for the young woman, which had made him so confident in betting on it with James. "Why?" he ventured cautiously. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, causing Liam to hold his breath for a moment. Had Neil hung up? Then, Neil's voice broke the silence, heavy with unspoken tension. "I think I might have gotten her pregnant. I need to know so I can make some arrangements for her. Can you get me her number now?" "You what?" Liam exclaimed before he could stop himself. "You mean to say you two had done it without?" Good Lord, am I really speaking to Neil Wayner, the ever-so-predictable man with no sense of feeling for another? "You, Liam, quit that. I really need to contact her urgently. I don't have time for your lecture now. Hurry up. Liam sighed, massaging his forehead as he said, all right, but before I do that, I want to ask you something again. What's that? Are you by any chance in love with Miss Harrison? He asked the only question that had been bothering him ever since his bet with James. He would like to prepare beforehand by hearing the truth from Neil, but Neil, on the other hand, wasn't ready to admit that to anyone but the woman he'd hurt, thus he blankly replied with a, no, I just want to take responsibility for my actions. If she's carrying my child, it's only right that I take responsibility for them both. Now hurry up and get me her number. Without wasting time, Liam got off his bed and grabbed his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard of the laptop as he absorbed the weight of Neil's words. I'll try to get the number, he promised as he placed the phone between his shoulder and ear and powered up the laptop, his fingers flying over the keys in a frantic search as he spoke to Neil about other matters regarding his company and what he planned to do next once he's free. A few minutes later, Neil impatiently asked, have you found it? Liam's brows furrowed in consternation as he delivered the bad news. Unfortunately, her personal number isn't available. It's been taken down since the press conference debacle. She's not receiving any direct calls unless you want to speak to her through her manager. Silence hung heavy between them after that, Neil's silence speaking volumes of his disappointment. Neil, are you still there? Liam asked cautiously as the line remained silent. Yes, came the quiet reply, tinged with resignation. Then can you do me the favor of going to her house? I'll send you a message. Make sure she reads it. And ask her if she's pregnant. If, Liam's incredulous laughter cut him off. You want me to ask her that? I'm not as bold as you, man. That would be awkward as hell. I don't think I'm up for that. Please, Neil's voice was calm, a plea that caught Liam off guard for the second time. It was the first time Neil had ever uttered that word to him in such a sincere, desperate voice. He'd known him for years and he knew him to be someone who was used to commanding and not pleading. Was 5 years in prison enough to change his overbearing friend in this way? Take James with you, Neil continued to say, find a way to ask her. Don't show her my message until you're certain she's carrying my child. Liam sighed, the weight of Neil's request settling heavily on his shoulders because he couldn't imagine himself asking a woman he'd never spoken to that awkward question. All right, he conceded reluctantly. I'll do it. What else would you like me to tell her? If she's pregnant, you can call me back on this number. I have a lot of arrangements to make for her and our unborn child. He said casually, causing Liam to frown in disbelief at the absurdity of the words coming from a man like Neil Wayner. Yet again he couldn't help but wonder if his friend had gone through some life-changing experience in that prison and when he was at that mountain, because those words were something the old Neil would never speak of so casually. In the past, Neil had slammed the doors on his face countless times whenever he tried to advise him to give love and settling down a chance, and now he spoke of his unborn child like he'd never hated the thought of having his own child and a woman to love as the most repulsive thing on earth. And the thought that Liam was now the one who thought of that notion as the most stupid and unrealistic thing was funny, the irony. One more thing, Liam. Make sure you don't make her feel uneasy when asking her that question. If she's pregnant, it might affect our baby in a bad way. All right, I will try my best not to make her feel awkward and uneasy with my natural approach of asking her if she's carrying my best friend's child, Liam said with humor, and I hope I won't end up being hit with a heel for being a jerk. After giving a few instructions, Neil ended the call and stared blankly at the burning cigarette between his fingers. He had to contact her, partly because of the solutions he'd come up with if she was carrying his child, but also because he desperately wanted her to know the truth about how he felt. He was now certain that the truth couldn't hurt her nearly as much as he'd hurt her with a lie. This might be their last communication, but at least it would correct the ugly ending to the most exquisitely beautiful days and nights of his life. Sunlight was peeping through the curtains and he glanced at his watch, waiting and hoping Liam would call him back soon with feedback from his meeting with Mia. He couldn't wait to hear the news about her and how she was coping.